What you're looking at are the people who have run this organization since day one. Some of the people aren't here, but everyone who is here, except me, really had the responsibility for doing it. And I want to start with Michael. Michael, my memory is you came down, you called me and you said you had something you wanted to talk about. You came down to the nation. And what you really wanted from me was a signature, because you needed 3 signatures to register the organization somewhere. I forget who was the president, who was the secretary, who was the treasurer. Do you remember that conversation?
Well, I remember coming down to see you, Victor. I don't remember the signatures being critical. I had more of a sense of it like, gee, Laurie and I had this idea, and like you seemed so central, you know, as somebody who had stood for the types of values that we were trying to promote. And I remember talking to you and, you know, laying it all out. We'd had a relationship as, you know, journalistically. And I just remember that you were immediately saw it. And I guess you gave me a signature too, which I don't remember the actual act. But your support, your sort of endorsement of the principle and the idea was the thing that I most take away from that.
Well, that's kind of you. I remember you talking about the ACLU helping people in this country, but there was no organization helping journalists abroad. I also asked Orme whether my memory was right, that I made a call to him and he got us our space. He doesn't remember that I made the call. So I take credit for the signature and not the telephone. On the other hand, I didn't realize that Dan Rather gave Orme $250. This is the news of this evening. $500 actually, even though we're only charging $250. But I'm interested, Michael, also in whether you thought of CPJ as a human rights organization at the beginning. Orme, of course, was the go-to person if you did think of it that way. But we didn't think of him as a landlord, but as a human rights person. So.
Well, it's a very interesting question. It actually became an issue a few years on because human rights is actually a subject that journalists were covering. And so people who would get involved with us were wondering if somehow they were going to compromise mainly the appearance that they were somehow plugged into the human rights movement. But I would say absolutely that in terms of my own thinking about this, that it grew out of that. I was on a group called the Fund for Free Expression, which was a subgroup of Human Rights Watch, which had many interesting people working for free expression. And you know, seeing Human Rights Watch take off, which began as these individual committees, and Orme was so central to that, and seeing what he was doing, it seemed like a natural. And the thing that was amazing was there just wasn't any group out there. I mean, there were a number of press groups, none of them were doing this. So we definitely grew in the soil of sort of the human rights movement of the 70s, but we then had to wean ourselves away. A matter of fact, Orme was our landlord and very generously, but it housed us. But we did have to move at a certain point, and it was also because we didn't need Dan Rather's checks anymore, but also because we felt that we needed to stand on our own 2 feet, and even though continue to work closely with Human Rights Watch, be on our own.
Okay. Well, the thing to me is I see this film and look at this organization, which is probably, as I look at it close up rather than through the film, the best research organization on people in trouble around the world from a human rights and free expression perspective. And internally, it seems to be magic. Joel seems to be totally in control and in charge. I remember it wasn't always that way. In fact, I remember the first executive director, I think, who shall be nameless here, got in trouble because she was accused of having of some sort of financial shenanigans. It turned out the financial shenanigans she was accused of was she didn't go to the chairman for permission to enroll in a Spanish language course to help her do her job. And it was something like $80. She probably took from Dan's $250, whatever. But the thing was, the poor woman who was doing a great job and working around the clock, I think may have lost her job because of this not going to get permission. The thing was, there was no one to go to get permission from. David Marish wasn't there yet as the chairman. We hadn't had a working chairman. We had Walter Cronkite as an honorary chairman. And so that, to me, was the first years. And then in 1988, along came Ann. And I'm interested, Ann Nelson, in what on the first day that you arrived, what you thought you were walking into and what your memories were of this unique and rapidly growing and transforming institution, which you helped transform.
Well, I'll apologize first for my laryngitis, and then I'll try to answer all questions briefly. But when I walked in, we had 2.5 people.
2.5 people.
Yeah, and there was a desk that was in rotation. And of course, it was before the internet, so we were faxing. And sending faxes to Africa in 1988 was very labor intensive. So we basically had half a person who just sat there with a fax machine while it went round and round. And I mean, I want to repeat what an enormous boon R.A. Nair was to us, because at that point it seemed really, really important to have rigor in the research. And we had people within Human Rights Watch, which wasn't called that yet, but we could consult with them and draw on their expertise in both the subject matter, but also in the methodology. And I think from the beginning we really took pride in that, because this field is really brutal if you make mistakes. If you say a journalist is in prison and they're not, you're discredited for a long time. And we really, really concentrated on that.
Well, I'm interested in how you got the missions shaped up, because you were on one of the first missions to Central America, and my memory of that was that also on that mission was a scholar named Alan Weinstein, and Alan and I had some disagreements about the Alger Hiss case, of all things, in print. This is long before he became the National Archivist. And you all went down there, and there was no consensus on the Sandinistas or on what was happening down there. And why don't you tell us what happened with your report, which, as I remember it, came out with Alan being the spokesperson for the mission.
Well, at that point, I was a 25-year-old interpreter. So we got to go into right-wing death squad front organizations. And Alan Weinstein would be speaking in one direction, and Gloria Emerson would be on the other end. And I would describe the dialogue as pyrotechnic. And as an interpreter, I was extremely challenged, especially since we were sitting among people who killed people. And I think maybe I fudged on some of the interpreting. But that said, I wasn't director yet at that point. And that journey, I think, exposed me to a lot of the vision of CPJ. And of course, as a journalist in Latin America, and El Salvador in particular, I had friends who were killed. Certainly Americans, but also many more Salvadorans and Guatemalans. And I think that gave me a real, a total commitment to the mission.
Well, with 2.5 people and no internet and no cell phones, how did you gather information and how did you disseminate it?
We used the telephone, and a lot of our budget originally was telephone bills. I mean, like a very, very large percentage, more than the rent, actually. And then we had IBM Selectrics and carbon paper and early photocopiers. Boy, do I feel old. And really, part of it was just refining the technique of writing letters to dictators and knowing how polite to be. And we did that, and many of them went out with Walter Cronkite's signature, so we wanted to get it right, be tough, but readable. It was quite primitive, but I think CPJ has also always been about innovation and trial and error, and I think the learning curve was very steep.
Right.
When I look at it today, it's just amazing.
Yes. I think we all share that. There's so much to tell up here, but I'm going to move down the row and then we can come back. Bill, as I remember it, when I would go to board meetings, there was always a question, or the assumption at the beginning was this was an organization that would help journalists overseas. And I'd go to board meetings, and I think I remember Tony Lewis and Harrison Salisbury especially thinking that we shouldn't get involved abroad, and that there was, we shouldn't get involved in this country. There was plenty to do all around the world. And then under your tenure, all of a sudden, immigrant journalists in this country started getting murdered. And tell us what happened and how you responded to that.
Well, first I'd like to say, Victor, I've tried to blot out all memories of board meetings, so summoning this back was difficult. I mean, it's an obvious thing that if you're in the advocacy business, you're a U.S.-based organization with a board of American journalists, and this was, I think, from the beginning, somewhat coincidental, but after a while it was seen as an intelligent, tactical move to not be an international organization, be diffuse because of both the power of the objective power of the United States and the real respect even among journalists in countries that might not have been great admirers of U.S. foreign policy for the institution of the American press. So we had this odd outward focus, even though we're an American organization. And the presumption, which was reasonable of the original board members, was that internally in the United States, American journalists had their own apparatus to protect themselves, aside from having the First Amendment. There were domestic guild and reporters for the free press and so forth. But you were often accused of having a double standard. Why is it you're only pointing fingers abroad and you don't look at your own country? And this was, and often from our best friends who were saying this, that it would make it easier on me as a journalist you're defending in South Africa, whatever, in order to say that you do the same thing in your backyard or your home. And we started thinking about what, within our mandate, could we possibly do that was not already being done by other journalism organizations in the United States. And as it happens, there was a reasonably well-known case at the time of a Colombian journalist who was based in Queens, here in New York City, who was murdered for doing investigative journalism about the Colombian cartels operating here in New York. And this was a case that preceded my tenure, but it turned out, I started looking into it with some other people on the staff, and we very quickly came across 5 or 6 and then 7 or 8 cases of the same pattern of American immigrant journalists who were largely working for foreign language or ethnic language press, Vietnamese disproportionately represented, who have been killed on the job. The same way that people around the world that had been killed on the jobs, the same kind of profile of the person we typically defended. And moreover, there was very little known about them, very little attention paid to them, because they were seen as kind of operating within this netherworld of an immigrant community as opposed to being part of the mainstream American press. And so thanks to our friend and colleague Dave Marish, after we put this report together, he did a piece on Nightline about it. And it actually did got the FBI to reactivate some cases of some of these journalists. There were cold cases at that point in California. So it was very much worth doing for its own sake. But I think that, since then, of course, we've had famously American journalists in jail for protecting sources, and there's been other such cases. But it was good to be able to find some legitimate area where we could demonstrate to the rest of the world that defending press freedom is a full-time job always, that it's never handed to you on a silver platter, and that journalists have to first and foremost defend each other on their own, and that there's nowhere, and it's not the magic of the First Amendment that has created a free press in the United States. It's 200 years of an activist journalism culture. So that was the theory of it.
You should know that these people, they were not just acting as journalists, gathering information and in touch around the world with a staff of 2.5, or however many you had, 3.5. I'm not sure how big it grew by that point.
And bequeathed me more than the 2.5 that they inherited.
But they were also creating this thing that has become not a monster ball, but the most insider Bigfoot journalist event in the history of the world. That the anniversary dinner was held how long ago, Joel?
This was the 20th.
On the 20th.
CPJ.
And every journalist in the country in this country comes, and it honors journalists around the world. I'm curious what it was like in your day, whether it was a big deal or just a problem selling tickets, and how the journalists who you decided to honor got chosen, and how they felt about it.
Well, it had really just started under Anne's guidance with Jim Goodale, then being chairman of the board. So it was a new institution, and we had to collectively, and this was sort of in the period when Anne and I were both working together in the transition, try to create an institution out of it. It was clear that we needed it, on the filthy lucre basis. And it was also, frankly, an excellent opportunity for us to present ourselves to the mainstream American media community, because at that point, we were still largely dependent, both in funding sources and in sort of moral support, on the same constituency that supported the American human rights movement. We as both Anne and Michael have said, we needed to wean ourselves off that. And it turned out, I think more than had been consciously intended, to be very useful on that level as well. So we decided that it should be, we could use this to create these International Press Freedom Awards and put them out every year without really knowing what sort of impact it would have. And I think all of us would say that it's been extraordinary, that the people who have received them, it's really, the idea, of course, was that it was going to be an extra level of protection, recognition for them. It was a tactical move that we thought that, we could demonstrate to this mainstream, bigwig American media audience the kind of problems that these people faced in these different kinds of regions of the world, but also concretely by singling out these cases and bringing them to global attention, that the people who were harassing them locally would think twice and thrice about it. And one thing, it doesn't always work. I mean, one of the, still most, troubling things to me, these pictures that flash before us. We gave, the first time, this was like working with American journalists. The first time we chose a journalist from the first world was we gave an award to Veronica Guerin, the Irish journalist. We'd never given an award to a European journalist before, but we were looking for someone who symbolized the then fairly new problem of journalists who were facing organized crime. It wasn't ideological, it had nothing to do with left versus right or guerrilla insurgencies, and she was clearly deserving. And so we spent, some of us, I personally spent a lot of time with her with the award ceremony and after. As I think you all know, she was killed about 6 months later, and it was devastating for us. And I think one of the flaws in this calculation is that, and this is, I think, very much the world that Joel is now living with today, is that you're not dealing with rational actors, if you can say that, in a way we were before, because whether they were dictators of the right or insurgents of the left, in a certain sense, they had an internal logic and constituency in their ways of dealing with them. But that, in a way, was almost, I think, the beginning of this almost, anarchic period, if you will, of attacks on the press, which is, I have no real concept on how you really ultimately respond to that.
Right. One of the things that moved me about the film was when Simon Winchester said, we didn't know that anyone knew that even we were put in jail.
Right.
And now, the way you talk about it, that's one of the great things that you guys do. So, we ran into him a few weeks ago. His life, he feels he owes this organization so much. In prison during the Falklands War, so there it is. And let me go to you. So you were the executive director on 2001, September 11th. Mm-hmm. What happened? Tell us what happened in the office. How did you feel about it? How did it change the life of the committee, the culture from where you sat?
One of the things I remember is the TV didn't work. There was very little that we could see. We just had a terrible TV situation. I think, actually our response was we were all very involved in communicating with our families. And certainly that first day, at some point after the first tower fell, I guess, I told people that they should get home however they possibly could. People were not actually calling us at that point. It wasn't that sort of an emergency. And then the thing that I remember the most, I think we, for a day or two, we worked from home. because it was actually really hard to work downtown at that point because there were, sirens constantly and people were going to the windows and wondering, what's going to happen. But what I remember was the outpouring of messages to us from all of these journalists that we had helped around the world who had been in horrible situations, wondering, how are we, And we're just this little office of advocates, sitting not that far from the World Trade Center, but, we weren't directly harmed by it. And that was actually a pretty amazing thing, very, very emotional for us.
Well, Ann and I are colleagues at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and I'm curious whether your students ask you about that and what you tell them about the legacy of 2001. September
The
11th.
legacy of 9/11.
To freedom of expression, if any.
Yeah. Well, one of the classes that I teach is a lot of the focus is on press freedom. So,
right. Yes.
We meet, I grab any journalist I know who's coming through town who, I worked with at CPJ and try to bring them in, to talk to students, to my class and also, to other students at the school. I just, one of the things I tell them is I want you to leave this journalism school understanding that you are part of a huge global community of journalists. Those remarks that Arun Dean was making at the end of the video, he's more eloquent than any of us are, and he's a journalist from Sierra Leone. None of us had ever met him before until his life was under threat. But I think it just shows you that there is really a bond, there is a community that, there are so many journalists in the world who are committed to the same kind of values. And when they hear from CPJ, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this from people. I got a phone call or a fax or something from CPJ saying, "Are you all right?" And it was the first time I realized, they will say, that there was somebody out there, that somebody cared, and actually sometimes you're just letting them know that they have the right to do what they do, which is report the news. In a lot of countries, you work as a journalist and never really get that concept.
Right. Okay, thank you. Joel, okay, so you have presided over the exponential growth of this modest organization. No more 2.5 people. And
Rent
somehow
250.
you have, speaking as one of your victims, although I was pleased to do it, you persuade people to go on these missions, and Joel persuaded me to go to Venezuela, and I'm sure his theory was, as the editor of The Nation, that Chavez would see me and see the mission. And Chavez took the occasion to go to Ortega's inauguration in Nicaragua. No sooner had we arrived.
Scared of
But nevertheless, it was a great experience for those of us who were able to be there. But you were on top of that in a very hands-on way. So I'm interested in how, as this organization has grown, some of the threats to journalists around the world, and how has the situation of journalists around the world changed, and how has the job of executive director of CPJ changed accordingly? So.
Well, that's a lot to cover, but I'm just thinking of Anne's description of the typewriters and the picking up the telephone and trying to call people and thinking about how we communicate with people around the world and how we monitor developments. Even when I first started at CPJ, you couldn't really, and that was more than a decade ago, just reading a newspaper from somewhere else in the world was difficult. Now you can pretty much read a newspaper anywhere in the world online. So we're able to sit in an office in New York. I remember when I closed my door when I was the Americas Program Coordinator, I felt like I was in Latin America. Right. I was just transported to Latin America, and I'm sure that the other programs felt the same way. So we've obviously been hugely impacted by communications technologies, and that's transformed the work that we do. And the other thing that it's transformed are the people we work on behalf of. Because while the traditional media is obviously grappling still today with a profound transformation and financial crisis, and there's certainly fewer foreign bureaus and fewer international correspondents, but there are more journalists, many more journalists, because basically anyone can be a journalist. It's a kind of mindset. It's a way of approaching the world. It's a way of taking information and disseminating it to the public, doing that in the public interest, and there are many people who are doing that all over the world using these new technologies. So that has also transformed the work that we do and will continue to shape it in the future.
Great, okay. And speaking of the future, what do you think is going to be the future of this whole mission?
I think there are two things that are going to happen with us. One is, we have an internet advocacy coordinator, and I think that the future of press freedom is online, because all the different media that we consume is converging online. And we saw in Egypt, when President Mubarak, when his back was up against the wall, he was able to basically unplug the internet. He was basically able to, in a couple of minutes, take the country offline, remove this communications infrastructure which tied Egypt to the rest of the world. He paid an enormous cost for doing so. It wasn't ultimately successful, but it was a sort of shot across the bow about what's at stake. And the other thing that I think we need to be able to do, it's a natural result of the growth that we've had, is we grew up as an American organization, but we really need to be an international organization. And that means that we'll always have, I think, a core in New York. There's a lot of value to being here, but we need to have more and more people in the places where journalists are attacked to be the kind of frontline defenders, and we're doing that more and more, and I expect that to continue in the years ahead.
Okay, now you have to tell me whether we have this institutional memory up here that, to me, you'll never find again in one place. So I want to open it up to questions, but I have to be told by someone in authority how much time we have for questions. 25. Pardon? Okay,
No,
we've got a little.
20 minutes? Okay.
We've got a little time for questions. Unless first there's someone up here who is burning to say something as a result of what someone else said.
I might just say one thing, which is on the future. The issues are in some ways getting knottier, particularly where America, United States, gets involved. So the WikiLeaks issue is something that we had to grapple with recently, and it brought in a whole host of new issues. I mean, the internet, is Assange a journalist or not? To what degree should we as a press freedom organization go to bat for him? And we have a policy committee and had some very vigorous, Cheryl Gold is now chairman of it, and had some very vigorous discussions of it. And I think we're going to be having more of them. And frankly, it was pretty fascinating. So I look forward to it in some sense.
Thank you. Okay, so anyone here, I see a lot of people who are very instrumental in CPJ's life, Josh and others, Franz. If any of you want to say something, you're allowed to give a little statement. Other people have to ask questions. So are there any questions or observations? Yes, all the way back. Do we have a mic?
Hi, Kathy.
Can you tell them
Hi, Kathy.
10 minutes? Bill, tell them 10 minutes.
What do you think is the greatest threat to freedom of expression in the world today?
What is the greatest threat to freedom of expression in the world today? Panelists?
Wow.
Is there just one?
We have to pick one, huh?
Well, if you talk about, as part of this, and Ken did the documentary, it caused me to go back and look at some of the early documents that we had. And so a big question is, and actually the one that we had set as a possible discussion is the press freer today or not? Are journalists more endangered or not? And going back to the period and some of the things that were mentioned in the documentary, I mean, Central America, when Ann was there and I was there on this delegation, I mean, it was, journalists were disappearing, being murdered and tortured. Argentina, there were 40 disappeared journalists. REA mentioned going to South Africa. That was just as well. And so I think there's a tendency to look on today as much more dangerous than ever before. And the one thing that I would say is different is the Iraq War sort of took things to a new level. It seems to me that the number of journalists, I don't remember, Joel, what the number who died
It's
there.
over 150 journalists and media workers.
You know, these types of wars of that sort are a challenge beyond anything that I think CPJ has ever had to deal with. And luckily it's reduced now. But I'm struck, Kathy, by the continuity, in fact, in what we've been doing. And obviously the internet has, and I don't know if anybody wants to bring that up in terms of...
I want to say that Kathy Fitzpatrick has done phenomenal work. Her work in the Soviet Union was a real contribution to the world's understanding of censorship there. The feedback loop. When you have journalists who are publishing online and audiences who are reading online and governments that intervene online, you're able to capture both the producers and the consumers of the content. And I just was on a panel yesterday with someone who had been in Iran during the protests there, and he had been detained by police, and he heard in the next room the police torturing Facebook and Twitter activists for their passwords. And once they finally gave up their passwords, they tortured them for the real names of their friends on social media. In Vietnam, the government has inserted Trojans so that the users of websites can be tracked. So with this incredible boon of digital media, we also have methods of surveillance that boggle the imagination.
Okay.
I would just add to that. I mean, I don't know. Well, I can remember when we saw our first internet cases. They were in China, and you know, as Joel says, now anybody can be a journalist. Well, at that time, all journalism was completely controlled by the Communist Party and the state. It still is to a large degree in China. But suddenly there was this tool that other people who were not journalists could use to get messages out, to criticize the government. And, you know, we had a lot of discussion about what to do about that. Do we take up these cases? Because these are not people who have press cards, you know, or who appear on TV or anything like that. And we decided they were acting journalistically, and they should be considered cases. And after a while, we got pretty excited about the potential of the internet and thinking, you know, this is what's going to finally knock down communism in China. You know, this is going to be such a force for good. And now, you know, some years later, we've seen that it's vastly more complicated, as Joel and Ann have pointed out.
Someone signaled me that we didn't have 25 minutes, we only had 10 minutes, but I'm going to call on two people, Franz and then George Black, and then I have a question for the panel to come there.
You know, the board of the committee and the staff, both are always concerned about the effectiveness of the organization. And so there's a very, I think, important, if not sexy question to which it'd be interesting to hear 90 seconds on from each of the panelists. And that is how significant a difference it would make to the organization if we were operating with a magnitude higher, greater budget. And by, I guess I'm talking about something like 50% or 80% more. But a major amount more than we are currently deploying.
Joel, you're here.
Well, I try not to let myself think about that because I get...
You're not going to turn down that offer.
Yeah, but if somebody's making an offer here, we accept. I mean, I think that one of the things that everyone sitting up here will tell you is that the demand for what we do is endless. And every day we need to walk away from cases, from journalists who are being detained, journalists who are being abused, and we simply say, you know, it's triage. We can only do so much. So, you know, I think we would do more of what we're doing. And I think that we would not fundamentally change. I mean, from my vantage point, I think, again, everyone here agrees that's one of the great strengths of CPJ, is we know what we're about, we know what we do. And we would do more of it, and we would do more of it with people in the places where journalists are suffering these attacks. That would give us the opportunity to interact directly with the governments, to support journalists when they're under siege. And so that's a pretty simple answer.
Good. George, did you?
I'm going to waive my right to the question, Victor, because actually the way Anne started and Anne and Joel all went was actually really in the direction I was going to ask, which is how you make the triage decisions where essentially anyone can be a journalist. 10,000 people in Egypt could have given you appeals that met Anne Cooper's criteria for saying this is a journalistic activity, whether or not the person works for an accredited organization. So I'll waive unless anyone wants to go there. But
I mean, I'll just say that we're a very practical organization, and we look at it, where we go, we read it, you look at it, and you recognize journalism if you're a journalist when you see it. And so that's basically our first response is look at it, understand it, contextualize it, and then make a decision.
I'm thinking about how I want to spend Franz's money. And I think it would go into the internationalization that you've talked about and how would this be done. And one of the things that I think CPJ can be proudest of is the work that Anne started, and I was involved in the early stages in creating something which is now the International Freedom of Expression Exchange, which is actually an incredibly effective global network of indigenous press freedom and freedom of expression organizations around the world. And CPJ did two really important things. One is it helped create this network so that the people we were relying upon had a global echo chamber for what they were doing locally. But we also showed them how it could be done, even though we weren't so direct about that, both in terms of our insistence on journalistic standards and what we were ourselves reporting, and being absolutely certain that the people that we were affiliating ourselves, we were also journalists and perceived to be journalists themselves. And now, I don't know what the numbers are, but there's many scores of organizations now that are part of this network. And I've worked in the last 10 years for the UN and had a lot of interactions with a lot of these groups in Latin America and Africa. And that has had a mushrooming, permanent, self-fulfilling, self-regenerating impact. But they all desperately need help. They need training help, they need resources, they need more support. So if I had my vote, and I think that's sort of an existing thing that functions, but we could readily find local counterparts that could use these resources very effectively.
Okay. Well, this is very helpful. I want to ask a last, take moderator's prerogative, ask a last question, but it's not the traditional summing up question because I think we're going to go, this is a conversation that's going to go on. It's going to go on, by the way, tomorrow afternoon when Dan Rather is going to lead a panel on war, covering war, and when Jacob Weisberg, the vice president and the editor-in-chief of Slate, is going to lead a panel on the social media. So we hope you'll all come back for that. But my last question to all of you, and I want to start with Michael, you all don't have to chime in if you don't want to, but has to do with how did you know at the beginning that the way to help journalists was to publicize their plight? And were there times when that wasn't the way to help journalists, when you had to be quiet and you had to work behind the scenes and you had to, and when people asked you not to make noise on their behalf or on other people's behalf? What did you learn?
Well, it's a good question. Terry Anderson would be an interesting person to talk to about whether you publicize a case or not. I remember discussions at CPJ he and his poor colleagues were sitting there, and the AP, I guess, made a decision that they wanted to do it, quietly. And then David Road, obviously, we had this situation again. In those cases, I think if a news organization says, we don't want you publicizing this, we cannot. But I think that the publicity approach, Arya again helped to create a methodology, and seeing those people in the boardrooms at in the discussion room of Human Rights Watch. I guess it was at Random House for a while. Some of the meetings that I went to, and the power to take on the Soviet Union. these small group of people. I think it's actually amazing how much that notion has remained a touchstone. Although, as Joel and Bill were saying, I think it was we have begun this program of decentralizing. We've moved our Africa programs on the ground to the ground there, and we're trying to do that in all these regions. So if we did have more resources, we'd do more of that. Quite expensive, but it seems to me that Victor, you mentioned documentation. I mean that. To some degree, we were always seen as a little bit of a wonkish organization. That we were slower. We've had this thing with Reporters Without Borders, where they are much more the flashy guys on the block, and we're amazed at how something will happen, and they're out there demonstrating and so on, and we're there like the tortoise and the hare, sort of. Quietly trying to get the information, and I think in the long run, it served us well.
Good. Does anyone else want to talk about that issue?
Yeah, we had cases of journalists in Africa where Rick MacArthur found one that was in jail that nobody even knew about. And so in a lot of developing countries, any exposure is going to help them. And so you sometimes have separate sets of rules for journalists from different kinds of organizations in different regions.
Good. Anyone else want to say? If not, Joel, and Ann,
I remember one year when we were picking the International Press Freedom Awardees, we voted on somebody from China, and when contact was made with that family, they said, please don't do this. And we went to somebody else because, they really believed that was going to put them in danger. But with kidnappings, you can argue this, guess about it, speculated about it sort of endlessly, and it would be great to hear from Terry on this. But another area where this became an issue a few years ago was with the U.S. military in Iraq, detaining mostly photographers or camera people working for Reuters, AFP, Associated Press, for international agencies, but they were Iraqis, and they were being detained, held without charge began at weeks, then months, and then literally years. And news organizations did not agree on that about whether to publicize or not. We had to go along with their wishes, but that was certainly a case where I think that needed to be exposed very quickly. I don't know that it would have really led to any earlier releases, but it certainly didn't help anybody in that case to be silent about it.
I think Ann covered it.
Okay. Well, I want to thank the panel for a marvelous. Pardon me? Terry, you want to say something? By all means.
Yes, I would very briefly. I know we're running late. The CPJ, in the 25 years I've been associated with it, has been involved in all kinds of different cases. And it is often an extraordinarily difficult and complex decision when you have people saying, shut up, be quiet, we're working on it, and other people saying, make noise. It happened in my own case. And I think the CPJ goes about it right. It's an individual decision made with very great attention to what the family wants, with overall attention to what is in the best interest of the person you're trying to help. They've gone in both ways. Sometimes they have been very vocal, and sometimes they have been very quiet. And I have seen both tactics work. What I have not seen the CPJ do, and what I think they can be extraordinarily proud of, is blowing it, is doing something wrong and getting somebody hurt or in trouble. And that is a truly awesome record. And I congratulate you.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank fellow panelists for a lively, informed, and very important discussion. So, would you join me in giving them?
We want to introduce.
Before we leave,
Yeah, you want to introduce.
I want to introduce our next speaker, and is President Lee Bollinger. And I can't think of another college president, university president in this country, or indeed anywhere on the planet, Lee, who has made more of a commitment on the issue of the First Amendment and press freedom than Lee Bollinger. And he has recently launched this initiative on globalization and the First Amendment, which one would have known from his book, Uninhibited, Robust, and Wide Open, that something like that was going to happen, and it's inspiring to watch and to try to be part of. So, Lee.
You can stand.
Thank you very much, Victor. I just have a few things to say, but at the end of what I have to say, please walk over just a block and a half to the President's house, and we'll have a reception there. So you just follow the line of people. This is a wonderful moment for the university, for Columbia, and I'm pleased that it's a wonderful moment for the Committee to Protect Journalists. I have the absolute highest regard for Paul and for Joel, whom I know now in different contexts, and the work that they do, and all the people who work with CPJ. Jim Neal in the library has done a stunning job of putting together this wonderful set of collections about human rights and human rights groups. And the library at Columbia, of course, is one of the great libraries of the world. So you should feel pleased from CPJ that your documents and history are lodged here. I think it's very important that we also acknowledge the similarity between the scholar and the journalist. When it's said, as was said earlier, that the motivation for doing what a journalist does is this sort of feeling that it's the right thing to do, the good thing to do, that it's in the public interest. That also defines those of us in the scholarly community. And while I think it's probably a pointless debate whether journalists or scholars are more at risk in the world, I think it's in fact journalists who are more at risk. A lot of scholars put themselves in harm's way in very much the same way that journalists do. And so there's a kind of special kinship here between what you do, what your papers record, and what we do here. I think it's also interesting from my standpoint to think about the history of CPJ and this being a US-based organization that looks at the world and tries to promote protection for journalists across on the international scene. My own sort of migration of intellectual life has been from exactly the opposite direction, which has motivated me to try to force myself to recognize the world as different. And by that I mean I grew up and really started as part of the First Amendment community, people from constitutional law who worked over a period of decades in the 20th century to secure freedom of the press in the United States. But that community, again, of which I'm a lifelong member, that community really left the international scene of freedom of the press and the norms and the protections about freedom of the press. The First Amendment community left all of that to the international human rights law community. And there is a sense of a division of categories in the intellectual world, certainly in law schools where most of freedom of the press has been thought about, that no longer fits the world as it is. And as we know, with the process of globalization and the emergence of global issues and the absolute centrality of information to dealing with the world and the role of journalism in providing a very special kind of information, it's just no longer even sensible to talk about journalism and free press rights in the United States and free press rights of journalists around the world, because whenever there's censorship anywhere, I say, there's now censorship everywhere. So we're all in the same boat, and foreign journalists are as much our journalists as vice versa. And so also, when you think about United States policies with respect to journalists in Iraq, whether it's promoting propaganda or putting journalists in jail by our own military, that ought to be a First Amendment question of the United States Supreme Court. And the fact that it happens in a war zone in another country should be no more relevant than if it were to happen in the United States, because it impacts the flow of information, which is what the First Amendment has been all about. And just another couple of points. I think the human rights category is one that can be too confining in today's world. It's absolutely right. It's to be respected enormously. The human rights movement over the past century especially has brought such extraordinary help where help is needed. But it's also now a very, very practical problem of how do you get the information to think intelligently about the issues that we all face. So it's human rights, absolutely, but it's very practical about information that we need. And lastly, I would just say, watching the documentary and listening to the stories and knowing what CPJ has done to really protect journalists who suffer enormously. I can't help but be reminded when I was a child, and my father ran a small-town daily newspaper and was the editor and publisher, and was going to do a story on corruption of the local police department. And he received a threat on his life from the police department, and this was a small western town, so of course we had guns. And I remember we did bird hunting, and I remember my father putting a shotgun next to his bed, and as a young boy, that was a pretty terrifying thing to see. So that taste of fear from pursuing the truth as a journalist sits deeply in me. And the last thing I would say is that all of this means that Colombia is your friend and your ally, and we've already started doing many things and have done. I mean, the overlap between the people in the journalism school here and the people connected to Columbia and the graduates of Columbia and CPJ are enormous. But the fact is, the issues of the time that we all are focusing on resonate with all the things we're trying to do here at Columbia. And so the prospects for these two very fine institutions, very important institutions, to work together and to build on what has been accomplished is enormous. So thank you very much, and please join me at the President's House.